Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, and I'm pleased to welcome you this afternoon to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives, whether you're here in person or joining us through our YouTube channel, to hear Edward Ayers talk about his new book on the Civil War, The Thin Light of Freedom. But before we get started, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up here in the next few days. On Tuesday, December 5th at noon, we'll have a panel discussion entitled Harold Brown, Offsetting the Soviet Military Challenge, 1977 to 1981. Author Edward Kiefer, former Secretary of Defense Brown, and others will talk about attempts to counter the Soviet Union's growing military strength during Jimmy Carter's administration. And then on Thursday, December 7th at noon, in a program connected to our exhibit Remembering Vietnam, another panel will discuss conflict journalism in Southeast Asia. Former anchor of Nightline, Ted Koppel, and other journalists will look at the role of television journalists during the Vietnam War and how it influenced subsequent conflicts. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events online at archives.gov. Check out our website to sign up and get email updates also. You'll also find information about other National Archives activities and programs. Another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership in the lobby also. At the National Archives, among our most heavily used records are those relating to America's Civil War. These holdings are tremendously rich, both in volume and in the stories contained in the records. Professor Ayers has great familiarity with these records and has shared many of them in the digital history project, the Valley Project. This online resource gathers material from several institutions to document the Civil War in August County, Virginia, and Franklin County, Pennsylvania. From the National Archives come records of military service and veterans' claims, the Southern Claims Commission, the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Census. The records in the Valley Project formed the foundation for Ayers' latest book, The Thin Light of Freedom, The Civil War and Emancipation in the Heart of America. This new work follows up on his previous book on the war in the Great Valley, In the Presence of Mine Enemies, The Civil War in the Heart of America, 1859 to 1864. Steve Donahue, in a book review for the Christian Science Monitor, writes, The Thin Light of Freedom gathers the stories of all these different aspects of the war's final years and transmutes them into a dark and oddly uplifting tale of the forging of modern America. It's a necessary addition to Civil War libraries. And James Oakes, writing in the Washington Post, says, there are hundreds of books reconstructing the lives of Civil War soldiers, women on the home front, and enslaved Americans who took advantage of the war to secure their freedom. But few of them succeed as well as these volumes in capturing the day-to-day experience of the war without losing sight of military operations or the political issues at stake. The body of scholarly writings about the Civil War is huge, and one may be tempted to ask if there is anything more to be said. But as Professor Ayers shows us, there are always new stories and new ways of looking at things. Edward Ayers has been named National Professor of the Year, received the National Humanities Medal from President Obama at the White House, won the Bancroft Prize and the Beveridge Prize in American History, and was a finalist for the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. He's collaborated on major digital history projects, including The Valley of the Shadow, American Panorama, and Bunk, and is one of the co-hosts of Backstory, a popular podcast about American history. He is Tucker Boatwright Professor of the Humanities and President Emeritus at the University of Richmond, as well as former Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Virginia. And most important to me, Ed served as our Founding Fathers Founding Fathers Advisory Committee, which oversaw the transformation of access to the printed papers of the Founding Fathers to a digital product, Founders Online. Please welcome Ed Ayers.
It's great to see everybody. Thank you. Thank you. So it's really wonderful to be here, and I'm so grateful for the National Archives. We're going to see if you can find the places where collections from here are woven into the story I tell. I don't actually have a prize to give, but the satisfaction of knowing should be its own reward. So as you've just heard, this is woven together from an archive that we've been building for 25 years, as it turns out. We began within the first 6 months of the World Wide Web. We weren't sure if that thing was going to catch on or not. I believe it will. It looks as if. But it took a long time for me to have the chance to sit down and finish this book, and I'm excited to have a chance to tell you about it. Now, it cuts against a lot of what people have come to believe about the war, a lot of what we teach our children. It argues that the profound consequences of the war were at risk from the beginning of the war until almost its end. Even after 2 years of war, many Americans on both sides, for good reason, did not foresee the unconditional surrender of the Confederacy, a wealthy and enormous territory the size of continental Europe, fully mobilized for war. And they did not foresee the immediate, complete, and uncompensated destruction of the most powerful system of slavery in the modern world, followed by the enfranchisement of the formerly enslaved population and the recasting of the American Constitution. All those things happened in just a few years, and they all seemed impossible before they happened. And one of the goals of my book is for us to forget that we know how that all turned out and to put ourselves back in the moment when these things hung in the balance. So I think we have to get down on the ground among the people who were actually living this history, who were watching it unfold in surprising ways all around them. And as the kind quote from James Oakes said, to include Northern and Southern, black and white, male and female, soldier and civilian, Democrat and Republican in the same frame. Very often we separate out the Civil War into different categories and look at them in isolation. I don't think we can understand any of them if we do that. Now, I decided the most advantageous ground to occupy, and maybe we could show this on the screen now, is in the Shenandoah Valley, not far from here. You'll recognize the district right here, and this is kind of triangulated between. This is why I have the audacity to say this book is about the heart of America. It was the heart of the Civil War at this time, and it's largely because of the positioning of Washington and of Richmond. Now, the events in the Valley often shaped the history of the nation. It was in many ways a Civil War microcosm. So in order for us to explore Augusta County, Virginia, and Franklin County, Pennsylvania, we gathered every piece of information we could find about all the people who lived in these two places, from John Brown's raid in 1859 to the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870. The Thin Light of Freedom picks up the story in July of 1863, and it looks as if the Confederacy might win this thing. Robert E. Lee is coming off great victories in Virginia. He's taking his army into Pennsylvania to show, as he tells his wife, the people of the United States that the Lincoln administration has failed, cannot protect them, and should be replaced with someone who will acknowledge Southern independence and bring the suffering of the war to an end. The Emancipation Proclamation, passed 6 months earlier, can only take effect when and where the federal armies triumph, and in June of 1863, that triumph cannot be taken for granted. The forces of the Confederacy and of the United States fought on a landscape that stretched for hundreds of miles from the places where the armies actually met. The war was a vast, living web radiating out from the armies and the capitals, constantly in motion, woven of railroads and rivers, of muddy roads and narrow trails, of marching armies and wrenching hospitals. Civilians lived within that web of war as well. Every family that had sent a man to the army felt the connections, knew the distances, understood how quickly death or disease could travel from a battlefield to a lonely homestead. Every mother, wife, and sister waited for letters of reassurance to reach them. But so often, instead, they received letters of death, disease, or disfigurement. Every family that had seen its barns and fields emptied or had seen its taxes mount felt the voracious hunger of the armies far from their camps or marching columns. Everyone who read a newspaper in Civil War America glimpsed the reach and constant spinning of the web, the invisible strands reaching to every corner of the continent and across oceans. And every enslaved person could feel the trembling of the web, the possibility and threat that it promised. So my story is woven of hundreds of moments of revelation and decision. Let me share some of those with you. Rachel Cormany watched the rebels' arrival in Chambersburg, the county seat of Franklin County, with condescension and defiance. Like many other young women throughout the North, she was on her own with a child while her husband fought for the United States. Before she had heard that rebel soldiers might be coming, Rachel had seen black people fleeing ahead of the troops, quote, coming as fast as they could on all and any kind of horses, their eyes fairly protruding with fear, teams coming at the same rate, some with their covers half off, some lost, men without hats or coats, some lost their coats as they were flying, one darky woman astride of a horse going what she could. There really was a real panic. All reported that the rebels were just on their heels. It's going to be tempting for me at every time to stop and tell you about all that, but I wrote a book about it, and you can read about what they're doing. They're coming up that road. Rachel watched with dismay as black people became the first victims of Lee's invasion. The rebels, quote, were hunting up the contrabands and driving them off by droves. Oh, how it grated on our hearts to have to sit quietly and look at such brutal deeds. I saw no men among the contrabands, all women and children. Some of the colored people who were raised here were taken along. I sat on the front step as they were driven by, just like we would drive cattle. One mother pleaded with her driver for her children, but all the sympathy she received from him was a rough march along. The residents of Franklin County watched as the Confederates dragged dozens of black people, free and enslaved, to destinations they could only imagine. Now, the people of Franklin County could not see the battle at Gettysburg, 25 miles away directly to the east, but they could hear it. The screaming shells of cannon could be heard for over 100 miles. In Chambersburg, Rachel thought of leaving, quote, but I could not think of leaving now. Samuel might come this way, and if I were out, I would not get a chance to meet him. Now, Samuel was at Gettysburg, a Union cavalry unit, and he'd been kept at the ready throughout the battle, and so he had time to make quick notes in his diary, bless his heart. He was posted at the right side of the Union center and watched shells screaming over their head. The heaviest cannonading I've ever heard, he wrote. One constant roar with rising and falling inflections. On Cemetery Ridge, he was at the center of the Confederate artillery barrage, enduring hours of incessant shelling. But unknown to the Confederates, most of the shells were flying over the heads of the Union. They were preparing to fight again when, quote, at 6 o'clock news came, the Rebs are falling back. Cormany went out on horseback to round up Confederates who were foraging or straggling. Quote, crossing the battlefield, Cemetery Hill, the great Wheatfield Farm, Seminary Ridge, and other places where dead men, horses, smashed artillery were strewn in utter confusion, the blue and the gray mixed, their bodies so bloated, distorted, discolored on account of decomposition having set in that they were utterly unrecognizable save by clothing or things in their pockets. The scene simply beggars description. So Samuel looks around. Not only has he survived the battle, but he's only a couple dozen miles from home, his wife and his baby. So he tells a corporal he'd be back in the morning, and, quote, I slipped away and was soon making time for home. Now, he had to be careful, for townfolk told him that he was the first Union soldier they'd seen. The rebels had just fled. There were still squads of them around. So he went to the back door. He saw Rachel and Cora. They had a wonderful time, but they kept being interrupted by visitors. They wanted to know what actually happened over there. And one of the things I point out, nobody actually saw the Battle of Gettysburg. We've reconstructed it afterward, but nobody could see all the totality that it was. But there are different kinds of scenes. Here's how those same days look from the Confederate side. John and Bowden rode up and down the road alongside the train, barely able to see in the rain and dark. What he could see and hear was horrifying, even for a man who had witnessed so much suffering. This is a 17-mile-long train of killed and of wounded men that Bowden is charged with getting back across the Potomac into Virginia. In the wagons were men wounded and mutilated in every conceivable way. Some had their legs shattered by a shell or minie ball. Some were shot through their bodies. Others had arms torn to shreds. Some had received a ball in the face, or a jagged piece of shell had lacerated their heads. Scarcely 1 in 100 had received adequate surgical aid. Many had been without food for 36 hours. Their ragged, bloody, and dirty clothes, all clotted and hardened with blood, were rasping the tender, inflamed lips of their gaping wounds. The wagons in which these men had been loaded were not built as ambulances. There were no springs, no straw. They were just thrown into these, and they were going over the roughest road across the mountains in southern Franklin County. The Rockville Mountain Road made things worse. Quote, the jolting was enough to have killed sound, strong men from nearly every wagon as the horses trotted on. Such cries and shrieks as these greeted the ear. Oh God, why can't I die? My God, will no one have mercy and kill me? Here's what it looked like from the northern point of view, that same moment. A Franklin resident lit the light in his front porch. He said, I became like a beacon to the walking wounded alongside the trains. In less than 15 minutes, the large hall of my house and the front yard were filled with wounded Confederate soldiers. The men begged for help. Water, they cried, give us water. And the soldiers kept his pump going all night long, taking turns putting their arms or legs or heads underneath the water looking for just a moment of relief. So you can hear this is not a sentimental view of the war. This is what it was like to live in this horror. I think that we tend to kind of prettify it a little bit. I'm trying to make that a little harder to do. Now, both armies were exhausted and spent. They spent the winter of 1863 and 4 rebuilding what everyone expected to be the culmination of the war in 1864. And Virginia was a key part of that struggle, for it was there that Grant would confront Lee. As a part of that confrontation, from May through October of 1864, the Confederates and the United States fought what turned out to be one complicated and relentless battle over the Shenandoah Valley. Knowing it was crucial for the campaign to take Richmond, for the survival of Lee's army, and for the elections looming in the north that fall, vast armies and guerrilla bands consumed the valley. And enslaved people sought to take advantage of the Union Army finally showing up for even a moment in the valley. The Negroes have had no chance to escape until now, observed one Union soldier. We have an army of them on our hands, nearly all of them carrying great bundles of clothing hastily packed. Old men and women, children and babies, all going for freedom. For the last 4 or 5 days, I've seen an old Negro hag, about 75 years of age, striding along on foot with wonderful endurance and zeal. She's walking for freedom, I suppose. And what this doesn't tell you is she was walking for freedom across West Virginia. So again, I don't want to give away anything, but there's a moment when the United States Army is cutting across West Virginia, and this 75-year-old woman is marching as fast as the army to keep up with them. Now, both of the largest towns in my book, Stanton and Chambersburg, were taken by the enemy in 1864. Chambersburg was burned in July. A local Presbyterian minister described the burning in apocalyptic language. Quote, the vast and lurid column of smoke and flame rose perpendicular to the sky and spread out in a vast crown like a cloud of sackcloth hanging over the doomed city. The sounds of the burning town haunted him. The roar and the surging, the crackling and the crash of falling timbers and the walls broke upon the still air with a fearful dissonance, while the screams and sounds of agony of burning animals, hogs and cows and horses echoed all around. A young merchant portrayed the human suffering. The people were running wildly through the streets, carrying clothing and other articles. Others were dragging sewing machines and articles of furniture. Children were screaming after their parents, and parents were frantic after their children. The feeble efforts of the aged and infirm to carry with them some valued article from the burning homes were deeply distressing. The roaring and crackling of the flames, the falling walls, the blinding smoke, the intense heat, intensified by the scorching sun, all united to form a picture of the terrible which no pen can describe nor paint or portray. It was such a sight as no one would desire to witness but once in a lifetime. Here's what the Confederate press said. We love to hear those cries of anguish. This howl of desolation and despair from the quarter in which it is heard comes upon our ears like music on the waters. It is sweet beyond all earthly gratification. Glad are we that retribution has at last put forth its terrible arm and assumed its most terrible shape. We would be glad to hear, in fact, that the whole valley of the Susquehanna was one long, unbroken, irresistible flame, not to subside as long as a house or a tree or a blade of grass or a stalk of corn remains to testify that it had ever been inhabited by man. 3 months later, the army of Philip Sheridan creates this scene in Virginia. It goes into the southern Shenandoah Valley, and they burn, in what is called the burning, a vast area north of Stanton. And here's the thing, both burnings, had no discernible effect, military effect. But we need to remember, this is months before Sherman's march. The first burning is in the Shenandoah Valley, not far from Washington, D.C. And it showed what Americans were willing to do to each other after these years of war. The major benefit, the major consequence of this turns out to be political, not military. So while the battles surged at both ends of the valley and enslaved people seized freedom when they could, black soldiers fought for the United States. Here's Jacob Christie, one of 4 brothers after fighting at Fort Wagner. We have been fighting as brave as there ever was any soldiers fought. I know if every regiment that are out and have been out would have done as well as we have, the war would be over. I do really think that it's God's will that this war shall not end till the colored people get their rights. It goes very hard for the white people to think of it, but by God's will and power, they will have their rights. Us that are living now may not live to see it. I shall die a-trying for our rights, so that others that are born hereafter may live and enjoy a happy life. That's a letter not written as a speech, but to his sister. That's why that after 250 years of slavery and injustice, they ask us to fight, and we rush to the flag. By the fall and winter of 1864, almost 3/4 of the men who had served with Robert E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia had been killed, died of disease, discharged for disease, or wounded or captured. The battered cars and locomotives from the valley, that's one reason the valley is important, the longest railroad tunnel in the world at the time, Crozet, Charlottesville, runs from Stanton to Richmond. And so when you have all that food in the valley making it to Richmond and to Lee's army, it's absolutely critical, running right along I-64. The battered cars and locomotives in the valley brought barely enough to keep the soldiers alive. Alternating between cornmeal and flour with small amounts of beef or pork, the soldiers ate about 1,000 calories a day, less than half of what an adult man requires. Hungry and often nearly naked, Lee's soldiers suffered from scurvy, night blindness, anemia, and chronic diarrhea. Back in Augusta, Nancy Emerson saw the suffering through the eyes of the women at home. But she took solace from the belief, quote, that multitudes of our dying soldiers have been met by redeeming grace. Here's the evidence she had. One of her neighbors, herself dying, quote, exclaimed with delight, "Oh, there's Jimmy and Johnny." They had come for their departing mother. They were 2 of our young soldiers who had died not very long before from wounds received in battle. No one knew the state of their minds, but does not this circumstance support the hope that their pious mother's prayers have been answered for them? She celebrated this evidence of redemption and reunification because, quote, these boys, the oldest was just out of his teens, were excellent soldiers, went to the army at the first sound of the trumpet, and had never taken a furlough. Their bodies were brought home and buried in one grave. Now, I argue that the only real turning point of the Civil War was not a battle, but the election of the United States in 1864. As one of the newspapers at the time said, if a battle is lost, we can win another battle. If we lose this election, there's no turning back. The newspapers spent nearly as much print on the looming election as they did on the battles. The Democrats vilified Abraham Lincoln as, quote, totally unfit for the position he holds. He is weak, incapable, vacillating, a time server, without either wise comprehension of the present or sagacious forecast of the future. Through his mismanagement and imbecility during 3 years of bloody civil war, the resources of the country have been wasted. Thousands of lives have been uselessly sacrificed and millions of treasure squandered, leaving the prospect of peace and a restored union as far as human foresight can go, as distant now as at the beginning. In August of 1864, Abraham Lincoln does not think he's going to be reelected. August. Sheridan's burning in October was important in proving that the war in Virginia would not continue much longer, because it wasn't much before that that Jubal Early had come right outside the gates of Washington, D.C. After all this and after the vast army under Grant, the Confederates made it right all the way to Washington, D.C. So Sheridan was sent to clean out the valley. But here's the thing. Despite that victory, despite Sheridan's burning of the valley and completely clearing out the valley, the election was far closer than we like to remember. A difference of 80,000 votes in a few states would have put George McClellan into the presidency. Abraham Lincoln, despite the vast stakes facing the nation, despite the Gettysburg Address, despite the Union victories across the South, was able to persuade almost no Democrats to switch their allegiance to the Republicans in 1864. Less than 2% of Democrats said they would vote for Abraham Lincoln. Nearly half of northern white men would not vote for him, even in the midst of the nation's greatest crisis. We've tended to forget these men as we look on Lincoln's victory in the Electoral College, but they were like dark matter all along, exerting their own gravitational force, bending and shaping the war and its aftermath. It's important to remember that nearly half of white northern men would not support the Republicans going into Reconstruction, even in 1864. Ironically, the Republicans actually grew more likely to embrace emancipation and its consequences because of the Democratic challenge. They had to defend black freedom and equality to their neighbors to make the case they would not have made a year earlier. As the Republican paper in Franklin put it, quote, slavery's ending should have come earlier, but, quote, but arrayed against the progress was every sordid and selfish interest, every besotted and brutalized instinct, every debasing and unchristian sentiment. To rationalize slavery, white people, quote, proclaimed the African as not of humankind or as accursed of God. So Republicans are saying, we all have our hands bloody in this. It's the sordid interests of the North, too, that kept us from doing this until just when all hope seemed to have died out, they said, slavery was now dying by cruel war provoked and made by its friend, the Confederacy. The same article referred to the Confederacy as the colossal suicide of world history, that it was only the Confederacy that could have ended slavery by trying to secede. And now they're saying, look at the formerly enslaved people, 4 million people. He says, in this broad land of ours, under the blessing of our government, they can be made useful to themselves, the country, and posterity. Let the effort be fairly made. These are words that would not have been said not too long before, but now the Republicans are using the power of the party to mobilize people on the ground who'd shown no interest really in African Americans to now have a generous and humane concern that would have been absent before. So the party fused the self-interest and identity of voters with a higher moral purpose. It reminds us of the good that a political party could do. By the spring of 1865, it was clear the United States would win as soon as Lee could be dislodged from Petersburg. But the white people of Augusta County, which had been probably the most unionist county in Virginia, voted over and over again not to secede. Even at the very final vote, its delegates refused to vote and said, I cannot do this. I think this is a terrible mistake and it's wrong. But then when Virginia seceded, they switched their loyalties entirely and were very loyal Confederates. Here's what they had to say in March of 1865. This is at a public meeting. We have a firm and certain conviction of the justice of our cause and will maintain it at every sacrifice of blood and treasure. The watchfires of liberty lighted in 1861 burn with undiminished brilliancy in this, the 5th year of the cruel war waged against us by our unscrupulous and vindictive foe. Our subjugation cannot be effected if our people are united, and notwithstanding the vaunted superiority of our enemy in numbers, having full faith in the justice of a righteous God, in the valor of our veteran soldiers, and in the patriotism of our people, we may and do set their threats of extermination in defiance. The white people of Augusta County would never go back into the Union, regarding, quote, such Reconstruction as but another name for submission to tyranny. The meeting in Stanton's courthouse ended with a resolution that would have been unthinkable only a short time before. While some of our fellow citizens oppose the arming of our Negroes, we are content with the knowledge that we have the sanction of God for using all the means in our power to resist wicked oppression. If such a step be deemed necessary and available by such men as President Davis and by General Robert E. Lee, we shall not stop to discuss abstract questions, but will cheerfully give our servants, as we have our sons, to the country. That moment never came, and the Confederacy died together with slavery. No significant numbers of black men ever served in a formal military role for the Confederacy, but white Southerners entered the post-war world, as you can hear, unshaken in the belief that they had fought a war in which they were justified and virtuous and maybe even had God's blessing. The white people of Augusta watched emancipation with disbelief. One white man thought it, quote, provoking, ludicrous, and pitiful, altogether, to see the poor Negroes crowding the streets. Some of them, especially the women, dressed in all their finery, rejoicing in their freedom. The poor creatures seemed to imagine that to be free cures all the ills of life. Or it could be, after a lifetime in slavery, the day you become free might be worth getting dressed up for. As the newly freed people of Augusta began trying to unify families shattered by slavery, the Freedmen's Bureau wrote letters on their behalf. Slavery had taken people unimaginably far from their families. Letters to and from the Stanton office connected with Washington, New Orleans, Mobile, and Nashville, as well as Chester Courthouse, South Carolina, Petersburg and Shepherdstown, West Virginia, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Morehead City and Goldsboro, North Carolina, Galveston, Texas, Chillicothe and Cincinnati, Ohio, and Jacksonville, Florida. Family members looked for one another in every corner of Virginia, but without information about their whereabouts, they might as well be in Texas or Florida. And they write to the Freedmen's Bureau and say, my sons, this name was bought by this slave trader of this name in this town on this date. Can you please contact him and see where he sold my children? Also, over 600 couples of formerly enslaved people streamed to the Freedmen's Bureau to register their marriages, which had been illegal under slavery. And some of them had 9 children together. And with those 600 people coming together, 600 couples, we can too see that they had been pulled from all across the South and had found each other for at least that moment. Now, white Southerners fought against black rights in every way they could, legally and illegally, with violence and threat. As a result, the Republicans of the North, 2 years after the war's end, launched Reconstruction. This is my impression of what Americans don't really understand, is that Reconstruction is 2 years after the Civil War, because we've seen Gone with the Wind, the Yankees are there, that looks like Reconstruction. But instead, 2 years passed in which other kinds of futures could have unfolded. But instead, the North felt compelled to come back in and to reconstruct the South. In this Reconstruction, black men would be able to vote and hold office as Virginia wrote a new constitution. And a remarkable meeting of Republicans in Stanton revealed what they were thinking. Benjamin Downey, a minister in his 60s, listened to a white former Confederate general who gave them advice and proclaimed that the white people of the South were their best friends, their only true friends. Downey, quote, had no prejudice against our white people. Some are kind, some are not. But he asked a pointed question. Why did the Southern people wait so long before becoming such good friends? The white folks South never taught us ABC. The Yankees did. The Reverend Downey reminded his listeners, black and white, quote, the Radical Party has made great sacrifices for us to give us knowledge of the living God by coming from comfortable homes north to teach us. Also, if it had been the duty of black people to care for whites during the war, a duty they had fulfilled, was it, quote, not the duty of the whites when they came back to do something for this faithful race, to at least help educate them? But they didn't. They actually harassed the teachers who came. The African-American men in attendance resolved their grateful thanks to the gallant armies of the United States and held in reverent remembrance the memories of those who fell in the cause of freedom, and especially of Abraham Lincoln. They demanded in this meeting that all elections employ a secret ballot, that no man shall be ineligible to office by reason of sect or color, that they be admitted to jury lists, that whipping and maiming be prohibited, and that taxes be fairly assigned. And they called most radically for state provision for the free education of young of all classes, something Virginia didn't have. To promote and protect these purposes, the black men in Stanton, quote, would look with contempt upon any who are willing to sell this dear-bought right for a mess of pottage. They would ignore the pleas and threats of their former masters and maintain their solidarity with one another. The white newspapers printed all this, and they warned black people against doing this. And they said, surely our black people, quote, have no ill will to those who have shown them only kindness throughout their lives. The white people of the county should have sincere conversations with the black people they knew, explaining that Southern whites had nothing to do with bringing them into slavery from the wilds of Africa. The transatlantic slave trade had been the work of New England. The black people of Augusta had become free only through the exigencies of war, not through the intention of the Yankees. The free people should know that the Republicans held no desire to see them awarded justice, but simply that the power and spoils might remain in the hands of the radical leaders, no crumbs of which will go to those who wear dusky skins. And this is how white Southerners sought to persuade their black neighbors and former property that they should vote with them. Again, I don't want to ruin the story for you. You have to wait and find out how they did vote. In the meantime, teachers came from the north to the south. Sarah Davidson wrote touchingly of the children she met in Augusta County. The Northern teacher admitted, quote, "I did not expect to find so many pretty and interesting children among colored people. There are some pretty and smart children in our school. Some of them are quite small, and yet are almost the best and farthest advanced scholars we have, and look as bright as they are in reality. It is indeed a pleasure to see their pleasant and happy faces." "The people were much pleased to see us," she wrote. "One of my scholars, a little girl, was standing upon a hill near her house. We saw her before she saw us, but as we drew near, she recognized us, and we soon knew she did. She stood a minute, then she threw up her hands and shouted a welcome, turned, and ran off as fast as she could to tell her mother who were coming. And when they reached the house, they found, quote, one of the neatest we'd seen among the colored people, the mother a most interesting colored person, both in manner and appearance, so much like white that if she were seen north, her color and skin would never be suspected." That's 1866. At the very same time, the shaping of the memory of the war begins. A procession in Stanton was the largest ever seen in the city, quote, being nearly a mile in length and supposed to number 2,500 people. Reaching the cemetery, children spread flowers across the 2,000 fresh grave sites. After the harsh divisions that had torn Augusta County for the preceding 5 years, with elections, war, and privation, and suspicion setting people against one another, the unity among white people was cathartic. Tottering age and tender youth united in a harmonious and heartfelt offering to our dead kindred and friends, the paper wrote, and not forgetting the stranger who battled shoulder to shoulder with our loved and fallen ones and now takes his last sleep by their side. The next labor will be to disinter and have the remains of the soldiers from the ditches, farms, and fields around Stanton brought to the cemetery and properly buried. It's something we need to remember. The first Memorial Days were literally getting bones from ditches and hoping that somewhere people were doing the same for your son and putting them into some kind of cemetery. The people celebrated the memory of Stonewall Jackson. It was the great martyr who had died before this, who led a brigade of men from Augusta and now laid all around them. They read poems elevating Jackson, alternating between Confederate and Christian hymns. On the same days, the African Americans of Stanton walked in the opposite direction to the Union Cemetery, where the Federal troops were buried. Hundreds of people marched through there and put American flags. The struggle over memory stretched for years after the war. When news of the death of Robert E. Lee spread in the fall of 1870s, the newspapers of Stanton bordered their entire pages in heavy black symbols of mourning. Quote, "Virginia, sorrow-laden, bends in agony over the loss of her greatest, purest, and best beloved son. The Southland weeps, the nation mourns him gone, the whole world unites in sorrowing sympathy. Our beloved and noble old leader is dead, but his memory will live forever in the hearts of his countrymen, and his name will be honored through all time." Bells echoed throughout the Shenandoah Valley. Up in Chambersburg, many people did admire Robert E. Lee, but the Republican newspaper could not forgive him. Whilst other civil and military leaders failed and disappeared under the turbulent waves of the war, General Lee seemed to rise higher and higher until during at least the last year of the struggle, the only hope of the South was centered on him. With that power, Lee's refusal to surrender when it had become clear that the Confederacy could no longer win wasted many lives. Upon him, the Republican paper said, more than upon any person does the responsibility of all the sacrifices of the last year of the war lie. Lee's final failure came in the years of peace, the Republican paper judged, when, quote, when he entirely withdrew from public life, abstained from all intercourse with the public, and gave no public expression to his opinions. Praised for his reticence and decorum, Lee also scrupulously abstained from the expression of anything tending to heal up the wounds. Rather than living up to the terms of Appomattox, he played the part of a discontented, dissatisfied old man. Though he could have done more for the permanent good and material prosperity of Virginia and the whole South than any other man in the country, the Republican paper said, he refused to open his mouth. The Republican paper said, we cannot bring ourselves to offer the customary absolution of the dead. Instead, Americans should simply let his deeds be buried in the grave with his body. So we have the idea now that the conflicts over the memory of the war are new, as we can see. They're not. They were there from the very beginning and all along. So what do we make of this remarkable story? How do we explain how in less than 10 years this powerful system of slavery was destroyed, followed by the most ambitious expansion of rights of any post-emancipation society? How does that happen? Now, we usually, and rightly, focus on the people who delivered the United States to this remarkable victory, Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant. There's no doubt that few other men could have accomplished what they did. My argument, embodied in the stories you just heard, is that we actually appreciate their accomplishments more if we acknowledge what they were up against on every front. The opponents of freedom fought so long and hard during and after the war that the U.S. government, the U.S. Army, and a small majority of the white northern population were empowered to destroy the roots of slavery and put a new constitutional order in its place. White Southerners who briefly called themselves the Confederacy played a critical role in bringing slavery to an end. Without their secession, emancipation was constitutionally impossible. Without their prolonged war, emancipation was politically impossible. Without their violent resistance to the freedom of the people they had held as slaves, there would have been no radical Reconstruction. Other losers shaped the story as well. The Northern Democrats opposed the Republicans so tenaciously at every step during and after the war that the Republicans strengthened their support for emancipation and then, just as remarkably, for the rights of the freed people. The Republicans knew that if they did not pass the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments then to the Constitution, that the gains of the war could be erased by a coalition of Southern whites and sympathetic Northern whites. The Northern Democrats never wanted this outcome, did not want Reconstruction, fought against it at every moment that they could from start to finish. As it would, it took generations before the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were honored, and we struggle to honor them now. But they played a critical role in the great and ongoing moral, legal, and political accomplishments of the Civil Rights Movement. The final group who played a critical role in ending slavery and establishing a new constitutional order might have seemed the least likely of all, for they had lost profoundly for 250 years before emancipation. The enslaved people of the South and their African-American allies of the North drove toward emancipation from the first days of the war, and they drove the fight for rights and equality all the way through Reconstruction and its aftermath, resisting even after the white South stripped away every right they could in the new constitutions of the 20th century and a century of segregation. Together, these stories remind us that the Civil War remains the pivot of American history, the test by which we will always be measured and will always measure ourselves. Such a history demands that we don't approach it with self-congratulation and a sense that this is the adolescent crisis of the nation, that we were bound to triumph over, that slavery was bound to fall away, and the nation was bound to survive, but rather recognize just what a close call it was, how viciously it was opposed from so many quarters, north and south. And when we do, when we approach the war with greater awe of its suffering and greater humility in what it accomplished, we can understand how profound a struggle it was in every dimension, from beginning to end, and even into today. So that was my yelling at you. I got fired up. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. You're very kind. But as gratifying as that was, there might be a question or two. So I'm happy to have one. Yes, sir.
I am in the midst of reading your book. I direct a national prison reform organization, and I found this in a lot of forums that I've gone to. People always talk about slavery being abolished, right, and yet there is an exception clause in the 13th Amendment.
Right.
We have 71 million people now with criminal records in our society. As I see it, and maybe you would disagree, within the 13th Amendment and the Constitution, they are still considered slaves. Is that correct?
I think that's a complicated question. I would say several things. First, I'm in sympathy with your general point. Second, my first book was all about crime and punishment in prisons and all this, so I've spent too much time thinking about all this in the South after the war. Third, there is a difference between, and you'll hear, and obviously you just read an article today about a slave trade that's been captured on video.
Libya.
And so the last thing we want to do is diminish this. I would just say that even as we continue the fight for justice and equality and all of this, that we need to be careful that we don't just use one word to conflate all this. Without addressing your point in particular, I will say this. People will often say, well, yeah, that's great, but it was still basically slavery, that what we had in the South after the war. And I said, I'm sorry, it's not. Slavery is where they can sell your children, okay? Slavery is when they can sell your children, okay? This is poverty, it's injustice, but it's not the same thing. So I think what we do is to look for the thread that unites all of these things, right? And to recognize that the provision in the amendment is just as you say, and that we look for the commonalities and resonances and connections, but I don't think we gain anything from conflating them or from diminishing the accomplishment of ending the chattel slavery of 4 million people. Because it suggests that if that ended, other forms of slavery can be ended as well. So you'll hear, I don't flinch from seeing hard things, but the fact is that the miracle of emancipation did happen. Other remarkably heartening things can happen too. So will you accept that I'm in sympathy with your general point, but I'm resisting? I don't think we gain anything from just saying it's all slavery. I think differentiating the different kinds of slavery is an important step toward doing the important work that you're doing.
Well, let me just finish up. I know others want to talk. I have looked in vain for research on this. It's very difficult. You start off at the beginning and say the Northwest Ordinance, which is what the 13th Amendment followed, that Thomas Jefferson wrote that. But then it just stops. There is no really digging into the weeds of this in regard to what was decided and the impact.
Yeah, what was that?
I mean, there is a Virginia decision that said they are slaves.
Right.
As you know, came out a few years later. But I don't see any writings or research on it. I'll leave it at that.
That's why we historians are always careful to leave more work for those who follow us. So I'll go back and forth across. Yes?
As you pointed out, both sides turned to God or evoked the name of God for their cause. Could you speak a little bit more to the role played by religion?
Yeah, you know, the whole name of this whole thing is the Valley of the Shadow, which is the 23rd Psalm, and the previous volume, every part of it's named after a part of the 23rd Psalm because here's one of the things that's surprising. When I began this project, I chose it in part because I knew that the people of Franklin and Augusta County were persuaded within a period of months to kill each other. Not only do we not have the most probably frequently recurring pattern in world history, which is people of different religions, these people belong to the same denominations, right? They belong to the same church organizations. That was my question. How could people who have not only the same soil and crops and climate, other fairy tales we tell ourselves, it's the industrial North and the agrarian South, but how could people of the same faith? Now, Abraham Lincoln's the most profound on this. He says they prayed to the same God, and yet one had to be right and one had to be wrong. One reason I gave you the quote that I did from Augusta County in March 1865, they never saw their defeat as a judgment of the righteousness of their cause. And one reason they celebrate Jackson and Lee and the others is that they seem to them better embodiments of Christian gentlemanhood than Grant and Sherman. Okay? So it becomes a crucial part of the lost cause, is that they went to war only because they were provoked by their vindictive foe. And then what you don't see them doing is what African American people can do with justice that we can see. They liken themselves to the children of Israel in slavery, right? Being tried because God loves them and testing them. The Confederates have a harder time doing that, even though they will use that language some way. You know, it's one of the profound mysteries of all of this that people can draw on this faith to rationalize whatever it is that they're doing. And you can hear that I gave the story of the Southern woman whose friend sees her sons in heaven. If you're going to find the great commonality among all these people, black and white, northern and southern, it is their Christian faith. But you don't see that it is the leverage by which they push against each other. Now, that was not satisfactory either, but you're nodding. I will take that as acknowledgement. Yes, even though there are more there than here, I'm still going back and forth. So.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
It was great. I was going to ask you about here in the district, 9 months before the Emancipation Proclamation, the National Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln signed into law the compensated District of Columbia Emancipated Proclamation Act, which occurred 9 months, which freed the slaves here in the district, about 3,000, also provided for compensating the owners of those slaveholders. Could you maybe discuss a little bit about the significance of that?
Yeah, I mean, what people would have expected to have been the outcome for the whole nation. And what Lincoln kept saying, hey, what do you say we compensate you? You quit, right? Mm-hmm. And they refused. So it's not only that the South seceded and then fought for long enough that emancipation had to become foundational to the Union cause, but then they rebuffed efforts even in the second half of the war for some kind of compensation. Some of these Democratic editorials that are attacking Lincoln's point out, we could have bought every slave 3 times over for what we spent. And so that's the sort of thing, looking back on it from the end. I think that in the same way that people could not admit that they might be wrong in the eyes of God, if they took compensation, it would suggest that they were fighting for slavery, which they never wanted to emphasize, and that they could be bought off. They believe more as time goes on in the righteousness of their cause. I mean, that's part of the tradition. You might think they'd be worn down, but instead, as you hear in March of 1865, they don't. And so at each step, they become more entrenched, even as you heard at the end, to give their slaves as we have given our sons. And that's got to be one of the most chilling phrases, right, to the Confederate cause. They're willing to sacrifice the slavery that has driven everything to try to protect this nation, but it's not clear what that nation would have anymore. So it's something that they talk about, but they decide that when Lincoln is calling for unconditional surrender, even with compensation, they're not going to do that. Now, what we don't know, and it's just like the slavery issue, something else we don't really know, what would the Democrats have done had they won in 1864? They don't lay out all the plans, right? Would some kind of compensated emancipation have been what they would have put in place? Because this is before the 13th Amendments have passed, right? So that's what, you remember the Lincoln movie, and people were kind of mystified. Why, of all things about Abraham Lincoln, you show him politicking near the end of the war? That's because he realizes if they don't get the 13th Amendment passed, and the sanction for emancipation that came from the presidential powers, commander-in-chief, is gone, what's going to do it? So that's part of what I'm suggesting is still in play, that we could have imagined that in most societies where slavery ends, it ends with compensation. And where they had control of it, as in the district, it would. So just as the other two things, we'll pretend that was a satisfactory answer to your excellent question. All right?
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
One of the leading architects of the lost cause mythology after the war was none other than General Juba Early. And I believe before the war, he was a very strong unionist from Augusta County. He was a state's attorney, I believe. Yet he had turned into the most unreconstructed. What part is he still living in Augusta County after the war? Has he moved to Lynchburg, or what role does he play in your story?
He moves to Canada. He does, because Early, and this ties into the other part of my story, Early is all the things that you say, but he's also the general under whom Chambersburg is burned to the ground. And he is held responsible for that. And there is some discussion, he might be tried for war crimes, right, for that actual kind of destruction. So rather than testing the courts on that, he decided it would make more sense to flee. So he does go away, then he does come back to the Valley. A lot of times he's going to be in Richmond and other places like that where you can play a strategic role in fostering the lost cause. He's from Lynchburg originally, and that's where there's a statue to him there. But he's widely blamed within the Confederacy for losing the Valley in 1864, even though Sheridan outnumbers him by many factors. But the Confederates still think that if he had fought like Stonewall Jackson had just 2 years earlier, that the Sheridan would not have over. So it's not like he comes out with high poll numbers. It's not like he's popular. So as you would think about, who's going to be the leader of the lost cause? This Unionist who has illegitimate children and is famous for cursing and drinking and smoking and flees to Canada, you might not put him at the top of the list, but he is. That's one more surprise of this whole story, right?
Final
Yes.
question.
Okay.
Yes. First, there was a review of your book in the Washington Post, and
Yep.
I got to say that it does not do justice to what you did here today. I really enjoyed
Thank you.
this presentation. The question about Lee and him fighting on endlessly, as an African American, I'm glad he did, because I don't see
That's right.
the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments if he doesn't lose overwhelmingly. I'd like to hear your thoughts on.
I'd say that I would be even a little sharper on this and say Lee and Jackson helped bring slavery to an end. If they had allowed Richmond to fall in 1862 to McClellan before emancipation had been declared as a Union war aim, I think you would have had a different outcome to all this. Now, I promised, I've got 3 minutes. Who can tell me what National Archives sources you heard? Okay? We do this quickly. Where did you hear the National Archives being cited? Nope. Freedmen's Bureau. Okay? And the part all about the letters they wrote all across the South and the records of all the marriages is the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay? Somewhere else. The eloquent letter from the black soldier. And here's the interesting thing about this. I was working on volume 1 of this. The New York Times did a story about the Valley of the Shadow back when the idea of putting history on the web seemed like a novel idea. And an older historian wrote me, he said, you would never find it, but the largest collection of letters from any black soldiers in the entire Civil War are in the county next to Franklin County, because the widow of one of these young men, the sister of the man I read the letter from, he's a widow because he's wounded at Fort Wagner and then dies after the war. She marries another United States veteran, colored troop veteran, in the next county. And when she applies for a pension in the 1890s, she gives all of these letters from her brothers and her husband to them. And so this guy says, I can't read them. And I said, that's okay. I know where there's lots of 23-year-old eyes who know how to read all these letters. And they trace it from the moment of recruitment. And Franklin County, I think, has the highest per capita enlistment of black soldiers in the 54th Massachusetts, of any place that's not in Massachusetts. I think it's because it's close to the border of the Mason-Dixon line. Then they go to Boston and they train with Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman, and then they fight at Fort Wagner, and then they're all the way through the war. And he comes back and he writes, and I'm getting chills right now, I want to march through Boston with the flag of our regiment, and anybody can see what we have done for this country. They'll be able to see the holes in it that the rebels shot through it. So those letters are in the pension files at the National Archives. They're some of the most powerful testimony that we have of what were black soldiers saying to each other. And the Freedmen's Bureau, to my mind, one of the most heartening documents in all of this is the speed and the love and care with which black families put themselves back together after all the ravages of slavery, and how they wrote. That's also in the Freedmen's Bureau, in the National Archives. And then finally, in the Southern Claims Commission, to suggest where you might not be expecting to find African American history. There's this woman who is, and these are all, we think we have the largest collection of the Freedmen's Bureau that there is, and let's see if this is where it is. This is how many of those letters of the black soldiers there are. Look at that. And this is where they're coming 1877 to make claims, and she's coming forward, and she said that wanted to know if they could get compensation. She says, I want to point out that our loyalty is indisputable. We are colored persons and only suffered our house to be used as a hospital and furnished sustenance and the attendance upon the sick soldier because he was wounded at our door, and the Confederates would have stripped and murdered him after he was wounded, after he was shot down, had we not cared for about us. It would not only be an act of justice to pay us, be kind enough to advise as requested. So here you look in these bureaucratic records, and you have these testimonies of all the people who were resisting the Confederacy behind the scenes at every step along the way. The National Archives doesn't take care of all these things for us, work so hard to make them available to us, share them when you come up with a harebrained idea like the Valley of the Shadow. We wouldn't be able to keep writing this history and answering some of the questions that you've asked that I hope somebody else answers. So I just want to thank the National Archives and all the people who work here for making all this possible. I want to thank all of you for coming here today. Thank you so much.
Folks, just a reminder, there's a book signing one level up in the Archives bookstore. Remember, there's only, 25 shopping days till Christmas, so this makes a good gift.